So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So you were just listening to the psychologist Brené Brown talk about empathy. Now that word empathy, without a doubt, it's become a buzzword. And as people struggle more now than ever with mental health and connection, human connection, psychologists like Brené Brown are talking about empathy more than ever. Some seem to think it's this silver bullet to many of the world's issues, except it's not. Empathy without accountability does not work. I recently read a fascinating book called Dopamine Nation by psychiatrist Anna Lemke. There she says, we as mental health care providers have become so caught up in the practice of empathy that we have lost sight of the fact that empathy without accountability is a short-sighted attempt to relieve suffering. If the therapist and patient recreate a story where the patient is a perpetual victim of forces beyond their control, chances are good the patient will come to be victimized. But if the therapist can help the patient take responsibility, if not for the event itself, then for how to react to it in the here and now, that patient is empowered to move forward with their life. End quote. Wow. Just substitute mental health providers for parents, for teachers, and for us, coaches. Today's podcast isn't about empathy, and it's not about accountability. It's about both empathy and accountability, and why bringing these two together is so stinking hard and how to overcome it. Nate and I are going to really tackle where we struggle as coaches to be empathetic in part 1 of our conversation, and we're going to offer some solutions. In part 2, next episode, we're going to talk about where we struggle with accountability, and we'll give you some principles for accountability. But everything we talk about here, it's about how we can merge those together. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name's JP Nerman, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. Each week, in around 30 minutes, we discuss common issues and challenges in leadership and coaching. And our hope is that the two of us and every listener leaves a little more equipped at the end of the day to be a better leader and to build a better culture within their team, within their classroom, within their business, and within their family. If you want to learn more about how we help coaches, head on over to tocculture.com. You can also get the notes to this episode so you don't crash the car while trying to type the notes while driving by just heading on over to tocculture.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter there. So Nate, when it comes to like not even just coaching, but even sometimes I think it's in parenting, or a lot of other areas of our life, I feel like we often feel we have to choose between one or the other, empathy or accountability in this moment. And what, me and you have learned and are trying to work at ourselves and help other coaches is that it's not an either or. It can be both empathy and accountability. But the reality is, for most of us as coaches, we have a tendency, I think, to struggle with one or the other a little bit more. I definitely struggle on the empathy piece as a coach and also as a parent. So let's dive in a little bit into the empathy aspect first. And where do you see coaches struggling when it comes to empathy with their players?
One of the things that can be challenging for coaches, for teachers, for parents, anybody that's responsible for the growth of a young person, when we are talking about empathy, is that particularly from an old school, or old school parents, old school coaches, that when we start to say, oh no, I want to understand the player's context or their day or their energy level, that in some ways we are coddling them, or we're enabling maybe a lesser effort because, oh, they had a long day, JP, or they're really tired or they're exhausted from 2 practices and a long day of school. And I think that's really what we're trying to find here is how do we, as Daniel Coyle would say, get to a place where we can see our athletes where they are and yet not necessarily moving the goalposts because of what we see. And so, you suggested here in the opener, like the first piece of that is, what is it that we're lacking when it comes to an awareness of the athlete experience? When it comes to empathizing, what are we missing? Well, I think one example is I know for me earlier in my career, and probably still to this day to a certain extent, I don't always appreciate or understand the consequences of the demands that I put on my players and how that affects the rest of their life. I don't mean the rest of their life when they become adults. I mean, if I want to have practice and ask for an extra 30 minutes, I don't think about, or at least I didn't used to think about, what that was going to mean for my player who's supposed to be at work 15 minutes after practice or has another sport practice or has to go home and do 4 hours of homework. Like, those things never entered into my mind. All that mattered to me was, I think we need an extra 30 minutes to get ready for our opponent on Friday. And that was justification enough without really being aware of what that meant for anybody else, other than I knew I'd be eating a cold supper because I'd be home a little bit later that night. I think this is especially important today because the tendency for most of us is to say, what more can we do to win a championship, to win the league, to be better than we were last year, to keep improving, whatever it might be. But we don't necessarily, again, ask ourselves, okay, what's the cost? What's the consequence? What's it going to mean for our players? Are we aware that they're close to being in a place of burnout? Maybe they're struggling to love the sport. Maybe they're not sure if they want to play anymore. And how much of that is my responsibility because I'm just not aware of where they're at in response to the things I'm asking them to do.
Yeah, because the reality is we're asking more out of our athletes than we've ever asked before, ever. And it's amazing, Nate, how many conversations I've had with coaches recently where they're in the off season and a player or two on the team, word gets out that they're thinking about not playing next season. And typically when a coach gets that information, especially secondhand, our mind goes to they're being selfish or they're not being tough or I can't believe that. Like, well, I guess they don't enjoy playing, basketball or baseball or whatever it is, right? They don't enjoy playing the sport anymore. And they could be, lazy and just not want to work hard in the off season. And that's why they're considering, quitting. Or they could, like you said, just be burning out here. There could be other factors in their life, but so often we jump to these stories there. I also think around, as a basketball coach, and other basketball coaches can probably really relate to this, especially around the Christmas break. I had very little empathy for people that had family events come up and there was a conflict. It was like, well, you knew what you're getting into when you signed up for basketball. Like, this is the game. And there was just never an empathy of like, yeah, they did know that, but it doesn't mean that it's still not hard for them to have to choose basketball over going to grandma's house for dinner on Christmas, the day after Christmas, or the fact that we got to go to a tournament on the 27th, like it's hard. It's hard to break away from that. And there was just such a lack of empathy and my coaching for many years around kind of that burnout, or those times where players maybe were a little less excited about coming to basketball because they had other things on in their life that just were naturally hard for them.
The original question you asked me here to start this conversation was, where do coaches struggle with empathy? And I think you've highlighted another area right there, is that when we see what's challenging, we see the obstacles, when we see the fatigue and the challenge, the schedules, whatever it might be that our players are going through, still trying to meet our demands, how often do we just acknowledge it and appreciate the fact that they're there, or that they're here, or that they're trying to do what we're asking them to do, even though it's difficult? And again, it's not about accepting excuses. It's really about appreciating the fact that, all right, you're playing two sports, during the basketball season, essentially. And I appreciate the fact that every day you show up when we ask you to, and you give us your best effort that you can that day. Like, I don't know how many times kids hear that. And I think the work of Daniel Coyle and Dr. Bruce Perry, they both acknowledge the idea and the power in saying, I see you. I recognize what's difficult or what's challenging or what's going on in your life right now, and appreciate the effort that you're giving us. Like, it doesn't mean, again, that I've got to ask for less. There's just something about building that connection of saying, I'm acknowledging what's difficult about this for you. And I think that goes a lot farther than we give it credit for, by just acknowledging those things with our players.
Yeah, one big change I made in my coaching, Nate, was, first off, unempathetic me. We'd play a late road game on a Tuesday night, don't get home till 12. And I'd come in on the Wednesday and like, hey, I know you're tired, but we got to practice. You got to practice hard. That's what champions are made of. And there was never like any empathy. It was just like, you might be tired, but I don't care. I didn't sleep last night. So stop your complaining. Let's get to work. And now I would say I really strive more to like, hey, I just really appreciate you guys coming in. We got to get some extra work in here so we can be ready for Friday's game. I'm just going to ask for 45 minutes. Can you guys give me 45 minutes of great effort here? And at the end of that, you give a great 45-minute effort practice. I might have turned around and said, hey, I really appreciate your effort tonight. I know it was difficult. You had a late game last night. Didn't get much sleep. This is going to pay off dividends for us down the road. But just like you said, taking time to acknowledge the struggle, like, what does that cost me? Right. But for some reason, for years, I felt like I had to just brush it off and just tell them to suck it up and let's go to work. And at the end of the day, that creates barriers and a lack of connection, and to be able to challenge them and actually hold them accountable. But like we talked about in the opener there, if you don't have empathy, then you're going to really struggle with accountability in those moments.
Now, here's another one, JP, that you kind of alluded to a little bit earlier. And that is, there's a tendency for us, when we have a lack of information about why a player is dragging in a particular practice, or why they look sluggish in a game, or why they're not at an off-season workout, we tell ourselves a story and we fill in the blanks. And this is human nature, right? Like, we just try to find the evidence that we have, and then boom, we start running with a narrative and we make some assumptions about that player. It's because they don't care about basketball, or it's because they're not committed, or it's because they're not dedicated, it's because their parents didn't raise them right, or it's because they're weak, or they're soft, or kids these days. Like, we can go on, right? The stories that we tell ourselves when a kid isn't meeting the standard or giving the effort or whatever it might be. And I don't think that serves anyone. It doesn't help me solve the problem, because I don't really know what the problem is, because I don't know exactly why the kid isn't at a workout or why they're struggling in practice until I ask. And until I have that information, I can't really do anything with it. And the other thing, JP, you've been here, I get to this place all the time, is that as coaches, we dwell on it. So-and-so wasn't here. I can't believe they're not committed. They're a senior. They're supposed to be a captain. They're supposed to be a leader. And we just keep this rant going. And the next thing you know, I'm short with my kids at home, and I'm angry with my wife, and I just can't let it go. And that story that I'm telling myself may not be rooted in any truth, but I just don't know until I've been able to connect with the kid and be able to talk. So in the absence of information, don't make up information until we know exactly what's going on.
Well, it comes back to our good friend of the podcast, Ted Lasso, be curious, not judgmental, right? But so often we come in with judgment and we have that story instead of a curiosity. And I think so often that's what empathy is. It's coming in with curiosity to really understand what's going on and being open to the fact that we don't really know what's going on and getting rid of those assumptions that we're so quick to make. And I think that kind of leads us to another one that I know that I see coaches struggle with. And oftentimes when I'm, having a one-on-one call with a coach and we're reflecting on a conversation they might have had with a player that maybe we would have talked about. And oftentimes that conversation might have been related to, some behavioral type issues, some drop in standards in their behavior or performance. And one of the first things that I always ask coaches in reflection on that conversation with the player is, what percentage of the time were you talking? And it's so quick, coaches to be like, well, yeah, I thought it was a pretty good conversation, but now that you asked that, I was pretty much talking pretty much 80 to 90% of the time. They asked one question, hey, what's going on? The player said, well, this is going on at home, and I've just been kind of burnt out. And then the coach follows up with this long lecture about how, well, you need to get better sleep, and this is life, and it's going to, you got to learn to push through this. And we just give this big inspirational speech, but we never really took time to listen and ask more questions to really understand their struggle, right? There might've been the one question, they respond to them, and we just jump in with that lecture. And I just think at the end of the day, if we want to be good at empathy, we have to shut up and listen.
Well, I think, JP, the research would back this idea that there are times where players just need to be heard. I think, again, as coaches, we just draw the assumption that you're coming to me and saying, Coach, I'm not feeling great today. I'm kind of tired. I had to stay up till 4 a.m. to study for this test. And we just assume that they're trying to give me excuses to get out of something, when the reality is they just need to be seen. Like, they just need somebody to hear, this is kind of hard for me today, to know that, hey, I'm on your side. I'm glad you're here. And, and they're there to do what you ask them to do. They just need to be seen, and they just need to be heard. And so rather than just knee-jerk reaction to, they're trying to get out of running today, they do this every week, just telling yourself, all right, you're going through something challenging here the last 24 hours. And I just appreciate you even more. 1, for having the courage to share that with me. And 2, that you're here to give your teammates whatever you've got. That kind of a message is going to go farther than, the stern approach of old JP of, well, life's not easy either, kid, so you better figure it out and bring your best. And that's what you owe your teammates, giving them that lecture. Just let them be heard, and then challenge them again to give what they can give to the team.
And the last thing I would mention here on empathy, and I think this is the hardest one, and I definitely don't have all the answers, but I look at the work of Dr. Bruce Perry and Dr. Dan Siegel, who wrote The Whole Brain Child, and their research around the brain. And there's something they always kind of communicate, is that sometimes when people behave a certain way, it's not, or they're not behaving the way that we want them to. It's not that they won't, it's that they can't. And so coaches really struggle with players' emotional response, in games. That'd be one example. Things go wrong, player blows up, puts his head down, it just has this emotional breakdown and becomes totally, dysregulated emotionally. And and we look at that and we see that as like, he's making this conscious choice because he's selfish, because he has an attitude, or he doesn't care about the team. And that's not always the case, right? Now, talk about accountability in a second, because there still has to be accountability in that moment. But to empathize with that individual, understand they just have not built up the emotional intelligence or capacity to handle the stress that they're experiencing in that moment. I even look at not even just the emotional responses, Nate. I look at like when a player goes from high school to college and they struggle to get to practices or workouts on time. And a coach gets really frustrated with that. And they need to be held accountable. There's no doubt about it. But we don't need to get so upset about it and so bent out of shape and always take it as offense. Understand what the issue is. And what we might learn is, for the last 18 years of their life, their mother and father got them out of bed, woke them up, make sure their bag was packed and their lunch was made, and drove them to the gym, and they were pushing them out the door. And now they come in here, they have no skills around to be disciplined and responsible for how to go to bed on time, how to wake up on time. And I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's who you've got. That's where they are. They don't have the skills to be able to take care of themselves. And you have to now become more than a basketball coach, a football coach, a volleyball coach. You have to become a mentor in those moments. But it starts with empathizing and understanding that's just where they're at. And now you can come in there and you're going to hold them accountable, but you've also got to mentor them.
Well, it's funny you say that, JP, because if you're on coach Twitter, like this is cross them off the list season. How many times do we see coaches and recruiters that go to events and they watch a player with a quote unquote bad habit? They don't hustle. They don't pick up their Gatorade bottle on the bench. They don't run from, in and out in substitutions. And so the AAU coach, or the college coach, post something on Twitter, cross them off the list because they're lazy and they're entitled, and somebody else picks up for them or whatever. Rather than saying, like, looking at them and saying, look, there's a kid that hasn't been coached in how to get on and off the floor. Have they been coached about what they want the bench to look like when they walk away? And can I coach that in them? Like as an indictment of the coach or my own coaching, rather than just the character of a kid. And it reminds me of this great video that's been going around on Twitter of Mike Tomlin, was on a podcast and basically said, it's not that players aren't coachable today. It's that coaches aren't good enough to reach those players today. And really just putting the ownership on the coach when we see the bad habits, on the coach when the character traits aren't there, when and then challenging myself. Can I get better as a coach to bring that out of that kid rather than just saying, they're not for us, cross them off the list?
And I think this is the great measuring stick for a transformational coach. I think as a coach, when I operate transactionally, I measure myself by wins and championships. But as a transformational coach, Nate, I measure myself by positive impact. So the quality of my coaching comes down to my ability to positively impact and change lives, to reach the uncoachable, the unreachable, the ones that others can't. And for me to be successful in that, to be effective, to be highly skilled, I have to be able to connect. And I can't connect without empathy. But I also can't have the impact I want without accountability. And that's what we're going to get into in the next episode. Thanks for listening to the Coaching Culture Podcast. If you haven't already bought my latest book, The Culture System, what are you waiting for? I mean, come on, seriously. The longer you wait, I promise you, the longer you wait, the more regret I think you'll have for not buying and reading it sooner. Links for the details of this episode, or you can just head on over to myculturesystem.com to learn more.